The Janet Mefferd Show.
Government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives.
The key is to stand on the Word of God.
We are relevant not because we are like our culture. We are relevant because we are absolutely different.
And I'm not going to apologize for taking a stand.
But if the Word of God says it, I believe it.
That's the way it is.
And now, here is Janet Mefferd.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's Frank Turek filling in for the great Janet Mefferd. Janet's on vacation, but I'm here to talk about Darwin's doubt. You say, what could Darwin have doubted? Isn't the theory of macroevolution been proven true? Actually, the answer is no. In fact, there's a lot of problems with the Darwinian theory of macroevolution, and for that, I want to bring on an expert in this area. His name is Dr. Stephen Meyer. He has a Ph.D. from the University of Cambridge. Yes, that Cambridge, that small community college overseas. No, that Cambridge, the one that's been around for hundreds of years. And Stephen has written a number of books on this issue. His latest is called Darwin's Doubt. And oh, by the way, it is now a New York Times bestseller. Came in at number 7 this week. So it's getting a lot of traction. His previous book you may have seen that's a work that is a unique work is called Signature in the Cell from just a few years ago. But today we're talking about Darwin's Doubt. Now, Stephen, how does it feel to be a New York Times best-selling author?
Well, I'm a little bit surprised by the whole thing, actually. The folks in the office who have been involved in promoting the book were hoping it would make the list, but we were shocked to have it come in the top 10. So it's mainly a credit to all the staff at Discovery Institute who have been involved in the promotion, and the good people at Harper One, the publisher of the book, who have also done a phenomenal job of that.
Well, you write about the complexities of life forms and their history in an easy-to-understand narrative form. You know, you take a journey from Darwin to today. You use the same investigative forensic approach that Darwin used over 150 years ago, and you come to a different conclusion than, of course, Darwin did. But before we get to that conclusion, tell us what Darwin's doubt is. What is the doubt that he had?
Well, exactly. That's the starting point. In the book, I do try to tell a mystery story, and the mystery that Darwin recognized was the mystery of an event called the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is the geologically sudden or abrupt appearance of animal life in a layer of rock, a layer of the sedimentary column all around the world that corresponds to the Cambrian period of time. And this event perplexed Darwin because he expected that new forms of life would arise very gradually as a result of natural selection acting on small, incremental, minute variations over long periods of time. And what the fossil record actually showed, especially with respect to the origin of the very first complex animals on Earth, is that these animal forms arose very abruptly in the geological column, very suddenly, not very gradually and slowly. And so Darwin acknowledged that this was contrary to what his theory expected and to the picture of the history of life that he depicted as a great branching tree in which the first one-celled organisms very gradually morphed and evolved and unfolded into all the forms that we see today. And he acknowledged that people who wanted to raise the Cambrian explosion as an objection to his theory were doing so in a way. He said it was a valid objection to the view here entertained. And
now,
so
when you say they arose abruptly, Stephen, how abrupt is abruptly? What does that mean? The Cambrian explosion.
Yeah, Darwin knew that in relative terms in his time because the radiometric methods of dating that assigned exact ages to rocks had not been developed by that point. But today, in the standard geologic time scale, the explosion has been dated. The main pulse of the explosion, in which about 13 to 16 of the major animal groups called phyla first arise within about 5 to 6 million years. Generally, paleontologists say it's a 5 to 10 million year event. So that's an awful lot of time in relation to a human life scale or lifespan, or in relation to human history. but it actually is a blink of an eye, geologically speaking. It's a very small percentage of the entire history of the Earth, as dated by the standard radiometric methods, but it's also biologically very sudden. It's a very sudden event in relation to the amount of time it would take for the neo-Darwinian mechanism to generate significant biological change, as determined by the equations that evolutionary biologists themselves use to determine how much change could take place in a given amount of time. And this is something I discuss in the book in greater length. But the point is that it's not only a geologically sudden event, it's a biologically sudden event. Much more form arises in a much shorter period of time than would be expected based on what we know and understand about how the neo-Darwinian mechanism of random mutations and natural selection works.
We're talking to Dr. Stephen Meyer. His new book, Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. It's a New York Times bestseller. You need to get it. And it's a game changer, folks, in this whole intelligent design evolution debate. I'm Frank Turek, filling in for Janet Mefferd. Don't go away. We're going to have a full 13-minute segment right after this with Stephen Meyer, so don't touch that dial. Frank Turek back with you with Stephen C. Meyer, Dr. Stephen C. Meyer. The new book, Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. This is now a New York Times bestseller. It's only been out a couple of weeks, but it's already hit the New York Times bestseller list. Easy to read, even though there's much technical information in here. It's written in a narrative format, as Dr. Meyer just said. It's more like a mystery novel. How did all this come into being? Now, Steve, we were talking before the break about this Cambrian explosion. Now, some of your critics, and there's plenty of critics out there because they don't like where this is leading, this is getting perilously close to the G word, that God might be involved. They're saying, well, Steve, you know, your Cambrian explosion, the real Cambrian explosion was a lot longer than what you're saying. How do you respond to that?
Well, even quibbling about a few tens of millions of years in this case really doesn't solve the problem. The complexity of the organisms that need to be explained is vastly exceeds the resources of the random mutation natural selection mechanism. I look, for example, in one of the chapters at the problem of just building a new gene or a new protein. The fascinating discovery of contemporary modern biology is that digital information is running the show in the DNA molecule, or in running the show in life, in the form of the information stored in the DNA molecule and information stored elsewhere. And it turns out to be, from the standpoint of probability, once you realize that something like digital code or a computer program is at work inside cells, and then you begin to think about randomly changing those characters that convey that information, ask yourself this question: are those random changes more likely to degrade that information or to generate something fundamentally new? And in the book, what I do is show that the intuitive answer that everyone would have to that, it's much more likely that it would that the information would be degraded, is supported by a rigorous kind of mathematical analysis, a probabilistic analysis. Here's just an illustration that gets at this. Imagine you got a bike lock. And instead of the bike lock being the usual 3 dials with 10 digits on each, you've got a bike lock with 10 dials. So now instead of 3 times 3 or 10 times 10 times 10 or 1,000 possibilities, you've got 10 times 10 times 10 to the 10th possibilities, or 10 billion possibilities. Now imagine you're a thief and you're wondering if you can open that lock by randomly trying the different arrangements of the digits on the dials. But you also know the security guard's going to be making the rounds, and you've got 3 minutes to get the job done. Is it more likely than not that you're going to fail or succeed in the time that you have available? Well,
you're going to fail.
It's overwhelmingly more likely that you're going to fail. And the same thing is true when you're trying to get random mutations to find one of the very few combinations that corresponds to an actual new functional protein. Even in all the time available in the history of life on Earth, there's not enough time to search the number of possible combinations to stumble on one of those functional information-bearing genes or proteins. And that's the problem, one of the problems I address. Adding another 10 or 20 million years it doesn't solve the problem. And some critics say, well, we should really include all these other events in the Cambrian explosion, and it's really a 30 million year event. Fine. It's still not nearly enough time.
But Steve, isn't the problem even greater than that? I mean, you're obviously hitting on a great problem here, that once you have this genetic information, how does it morph itself into further genetic information to help build new body plans? But how does a critic respond to your assertion, or your question, I should say, as to where the genetic information, the original genetic information, came from in the first place? What do they say?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge problem, and I address that in the book. Actually, the origin of genetic information itself is the subject of my first book, Signature of the Cell, because you've got to have information not only to build new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms. You have to have genetic information in order to build the proteins that are necessary to make the very first living cell. And in the first book, I showed that was a huge problem to the whole evolutionary synthesis. And really, I have to say, after 4 years of reading responses and so forth, that no one has really refuted that argument. In fact, the most common refutation was, well, yeah, it's a problem. The origin of life is a huge problem. We all acknowledge that, but at least Darwinian evolution can generate new information. And that obviously isn't an adequate response to the first book, because Darwinian evolution, the processes involved in Darwinian evolution, natural selection and random mutation, only become relevant once you have living organisms. Mm-hmm. But I got tired of hearing that response, and because I am skeptical that mutation and selection can build the new information you need to build new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms, I wrote the second book, because I think that the problem of the origin of information is a problem that afflicts both forms of evolutionary theory, so-called chemical evolution, which attempts to explain the origin of the first life, and biological evolution, which attempts to explain everything else. And in the second book, I show that the information problem, really for several separate reasons, is something that exceeds the creative capacities of the neo-Darwinian mechanism. And so to answer the other part of your question, yes, it's deep. The problem is deeper than just building new genes. Mm-hmm. You've got to build whole new body plans, and that requires a form of information that is not encoded in the genes, called epigenetic information. Mm-hmm. And so the odd thing there is that even if you overlook the probability problem that I just mentioned for building a new gene or protein, you've got to have a mechanism that can organize proteins into cell types, and cell types into organs and tissues, and organs and tissues into whole new forms of organisms called body plans or body architectures. And we now know that the information for doing that isn't even encoded in the genes. It's a different form of information that's stored other places in the embryo and in animals. And so what that means is you could mutate DNA indefinitely till the cows come home, and you're never going to build a new animal. And yet that's the mechanism that neo-Darwinism relies on, the mutations of genes. And so there are deeper and more fundamental problems in trying to explain the origin of whole new animals than just the origin of genes, and I address those in the book as well.
Now, Steve, of course, the other side is trying to say you're not doing science, and this has got to the gaps, and you're endangering children everywhere.
Well, they haven't quite gone to that length, but the other two charges, yes, absolutely. And you and I have talked about this.
Sure.
We talked about this on your show the other day. And the philosophical issues in this are right beneath the surface. There was a review yesterday, in fact, in the New Yorker.
Right, I've seen it. Yes,
an organ of establishment opinion, which it was full of oddly backhanded compliments about the book.
Right.
It said it was I can't remember the exact words of a masterpiece of pseudoscience.
Yeah.
But what makes the argument for intelligent design pseudoscience is one and only one thing, and that is that it breaks the rule of methodological materialism by invoking a non-materialistic explanation for, in this case, the explosion of information that arises in the Cambrian explosion. Now, why does that constitute pseudoscience? That is entirely a matter of arbitrary definition. One side wants to say science is finding the best materialistic explanation and must exclude all other forms of explanation, And the intelligent design side of the argument, our side, says no. Scientists ought to be free to follow the evidence where it leads. And if you're looking at information or information-rich structures or circuits or information processing systems, you're looking at effects which are known from experience, from uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, to arise from one and only one type of cause. And that cause is intelligence, or as one information scientist put it, conscious and rational experience, or conscious and rational activity. So we think the fundamental obligation of the scientist is to follow the evidence where it leads, in accord with what we know about our cause and effect, our experience of cause and effect in the world. The other side says, yes, we should let cause and effect guide our reconstructions of what happened in the past, but we should limit those reconstructions to invoking only materialistic explanations. And I think that's an arbitrary limitation on the freedom of the scientist to follow the evidence where it leads. And so I think actually the so-called pseudo-scientific theory of intelligent design is more scientific because it's letting the evidence dictate the conclusion.
I love what you write here on page 391. We're talking to Stephen Meyer. His book is called Darwin's Doubt. You need to get it. It's a New York Times bestseller. Only been out a couple of weeks, but you write this on page 391. Neo-Darwinism and the theory of intelligent design are not two different kinds of inquiry, as some critics have asserted. They are two different answers formulated using a similar logic and method of reasoning to the same question: what caused biological forms and the appearance of design in the history of life? So you're doing the same, you're using the same methods of science, Steve, but when you interpret the data, you are interpreting the data based on what you know about reality, namely that information only comes from an intelligent mind, specified complexity, and that if you see a fully formed fossil with no fossilized precursors, the better explanation you're saying, if I'm understanding you rightly here, and correct me if I'm wrong, that would be the product of intelligence, correct?
Yeah, it's so exciting for me to have this conversation with a trained philosopher. You nailed it. I mean, the issue really is an attempt to define the one point of view out of existence. Mm-hmm. You've got, because what's said is, look, the Darwinian argument is scientific. Darwin's theory attempts to explain the appearance of design as a result of an unguided, undirected process, such that it affirms that appearance of design is an illusion. In other words, it's arguing, classical Darwinism and neo-Darwinism argue that the appearance of design is an illusion. There is no design, only the unguided, undirected process. That's one attempt to explain the appearance of design. The other attempt to explain the very same phenomenon is an actual intelligent design. So you've got two competing hypotheses, both attempting to explain the same phenomenon, and one is deemed scientific, the other is deemed pseudoscience. One is deemed science, the other is deemed religion or metaphysical speculation. Really, that's a red herring. The question isn't how we classify the competing theories. The question is which one is true, which one is better supported by the evidence. And as you just articulated beautifully, the case for intelligent design is evidence-based. It's based on the presence of information and in the case of the Cambrian explosion, an explosion of information in the history of life as documented by the fossil record, and it's based on what we know about the cause and effect patterns in the world. We know of only one cause which is adequate to produce information, and that's conscious and rational activity, and especially to produce such an explosion of information, and an explosion, moreover, information in a digital form. It's extraordinary.
Now, Steve, there is one thing that your critics could do to totally destroy your argument, and we're going to talk about it right after the break. If they could do this, it would destroy the argument. They can't, and we'll talk about it in a minute. I'm Frank Turek. We're talking to Stephen Meyer, his new book, Darwin's Doubt. You need to get it. New York Times bestseller. Back in just 3 minutes. Don't touch the dial. Welcome back. Frank Turek with you on the Janet Mefferd Show. Janet's on vacation. I'm Frank Turek filling in for her. My guest is Dr. Stephen Meyer. His new book is called Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. And Steve, I mentioned before the break that there is one thing that the Darwinists could do to totally destroy this book and the previous book you wrote. In other words, refute the thesis. If they could demonstrate how natural forces can instantaneously create the genetic code for the first life and then instantaneously create massive new amounts of genetic information for the body changes in new life forms, your theory basically would crumble. Now, when you put it to them, here, this is what you need to do to show how natural forces could do this, what kind of responses have you gotten?
Well, that's a really apropos question, because the day after the book was published, there was a 9,400-word review posted on one of the Darwinist websites called Pandas Thumb. And the reviewer there, he had a lot of quibbles about classification and things of that sort. But he did try to revive an argument that he started years before about whether or not the Darwinian mechanism could generate new information. In 2004, I published a paper that was, in a sense, a road testing in a technical journal, the article that has become this book. And immediately thereafter, there was a huge controversy at the Smithsonian Institution, out of which the journal was published. The journal never ran a rebuttal article, but there was an online article published, or an internet article published by three guys, Matsky, Nick Matsky, and two others. And Nick Matsky has rejoined that argument as book is being published, and he cites a paper that was published in 2003 claiming to be about the origin of genes. But I show in the 11th chapter of the new book, Darwin's Doubt, that the article is not actually about the origin of genetic information. It's about the history of genes that have that are being where one pre-existing module of genetic information is being fused with another piece of pre-existing genetic information, and other similar processes. So the article is actually about how pre-existing cassettes or modules of genetic information are being combined and recombined inside living organisms, and these kinds of things do happen. But this doesn't really solve the problem of the origin of genetic information. It would be like saying, okay, here I have this chapter from one book, and I'm going to combine it with a chapter from another book, and now I've got a nice anthology. But you didn't really explain, but no account was given of the origin of those initial articles or chapters, apart from the author who wrote them. And so this is the kind of thing that's being offered as a refutation of my argument for that intelligent design is necessary to generate new information, and that random mutations and natural selection cannot generate or has not been shown to have the capacity to generate that new information. Interestingly, in this review by this graduate student at Berkeley, Nicholas Matsky, instead of responding to the critique I make of his citation of that 2003 article, he simply cites it again as if it were a refutation of the argument, not engaging the extensive rebuttal of his original argument that's in the book.
You know, Steve, I've watched several debates you've had recently. You had a debate with Peter Atkins. You had a debate with Peter Ward. You had a debate with Michael Ruse. These are all atheists and Darwinists, or at least agnostics and Darwinists. And when you posed this question to them, what natural mechanism can create specified and complex information? Peter Ward said, he didn't have an answer. He just said it's nonsense what you're saying, Steve. Atkins said something like, that's crap, or something like that. And then he said, well, I know how you get information. You get information when a bathtub empties, you get this swirl. And you pointed out rightly there's a difference between structure and information. And he never responded to that.
Yeah, between order and information. Exactly. Order has a redundant or symmetrical quality to it. A mantra, the same characters over and over again, is orderly, but it's not informative. And the kinds of there's a new model, and I address this in the new book, a new model of which invokes a mechanism of which invokes mechanisms of self-organization. And there are processes that work inside living organisms that can be explained by there are features of living organisms that can be explained by self-organizational processes, but the information in living organisms cannot be explained that way. Vortices and crystals, things that have a redundant or repetitive structure to them, are not informational. Self-organization explains well what doesn't need to be explained. That kind of redundant order, it doesn't explain information.
Now, why are people resisting this kind of thinking? We're going to talk about it when we come back with Dr. Stephen Meyer, his new book, Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. I'm Frank Turek, back in just a few minutes. Touch that dial. If you want the latest on the debate between the intelligent design theorists and the Darwinists, you need to get Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. My guest today is Stephen C. Meyer, the author of this New York Times bestseller. And Steve, this is not God of the Gaps reasoning, because you're arguing from what you do know, not from what you don't know. Unpack that just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's often said that this is a God of the Gaps argument, or that it's an argument from ignorance. But an argument from ignorance would have the following form. The neo-Darwinian mechanism does not appear to be sufficient to build the new information necessary to construct new forms of life, such as the rise in the Cambrian. Therefore, God did it, or therefore it was intelligently designed. That's not how I'm arguing. The argument is that the neo-Darwinian mechanism and other similar undirected evolutionary mechanisms lack the creative power to generate the information needed to build the Cambrian animals. But there is a cause of which we know that is capable of generating information of the kind that is present in the Cambrian explosion, the digital information of the kind that we see in DNA. And that cause is intelligence. So, therefore, intelligent design provides the best explanation based on what we know about the cause and effect patterns of the world, about what certain types of causes can produce and what other types of causes have not been demonstrated to produce. So the argument is not an argument from ignorance. It's an argument of the form that we call an inference to the best explanation, where the best explanation is an explanation that invokes a cause which is known from experience to produce the effect in question.
Steve, this is a key point we need to amplify. And you point out in the book, you're using the same historical forensic method that Darwin and other neo-Darwinists used to try and figure out a historical question, and that is the origin of new life forms. You're using the same methods, but you're coming to a different conclusion because you're open to the possibility that intelligence is involved, where the other side philosophically is not. Well, and I think that needs to be amplified.
Right, absolutely. And also, I'm coming to a different conclusion because we know things today that Darwin didn't know about in his time, namely that life is full of information and that information is running the show inside living organisms and inside animals. But yeah, absolutely, the logic of this is really important. And I came to it because I myself was wondering, could these critiques, could we move beyond just a critique of neo-Darwinism to formulate a positive alternative for the theory of intelligent design? And ironically, I came to the conclusion that it was possible to formulate such a theory by reading the works of Darwin himself. And I was reading not only with a scientific eye, but also with an eye toward the methodology, the scientific methods that he used to reconstruct events in the remote past. Because if you think about it, when you're trying to figure out what happened to cause the Cambrian explosion, you're not talking about an event that can be replicated in the laboratory under controlled conditions. So you're not doing the same kind of science that most scientists do when they're at the bench. It's not an experimental form of science. It's more, as you say, a forensic or historical form where you're trying to infer what happened in the past based on analyzing the clues that are left behind and based on what we know about what different kinds of processes and causes can and can't produce. So I came across, as I was studying Darwin's work, I realized that he was using a method of reasoning that's known alternately as a method of multiple competing hypotheses or the method of inference to the best explanation. And he had an important rule of reasoning that helped decide, that was, in a sense, a criterion for deciding what constituted a best explanation. And that rule is that we should be invoking causes which are known to produce the effect in question. So as I began to think about that in relation to this crucial question of the origin of information, I asked myself a question. What is the cause known from our present experience which is capable of producing information in a digital form or other forms? And I realized there was only one such cause, and that cause is intelligence. It's mind. It's, as one information scientist put it, the creation of information is habitually associated with conscious activity.
Now, this is no different than the archaeologists who discovered the Rosetta Stone. They came to the same conclusion, right?
Well, they're using the same method. They know from experience that it takes a mind to generate information. So when they discovered or determined that the etchings on the Rosetta Stone were actually forms of hieroglyphic and alphabetic text that was, ergo, informational, it was almost so trivial it didn't need inferring. They knew that there was a mind, a scribe behind this, that it wasn't produced by wind and erosion. So information is a distinctive hallmark of intelligent activity. When we find it inside life, when we see that it was part and parcel of the Cambrian explosion, that the explosion was an explosion of information, I argue we have strong grounds for inferring that a mind and intelligence was involved in that event.
Now, friends, the truth of the matter here is that science doesn't say anything, scientists do. All data needs to be interpreted, and Dr. Meyer is just interpreting the data based on what he knows about reality from previous experience, where the Darwinists, instead of trying to meet his objection or his thesis head on, they try and say, well, you're not doing science, you're doing pseudoscience and all this nonsense. They won't deal with the argument, which is the most frustrating thing. Now, Steve, we got 2 minutes before the break. I know this is a bigger topic than what we can unpack in 2 minutes, but you point out here that with some of these scientists, it's easier to talk about politics and religion than it is to talk about Darwinism. Why is this such a sensitive issue for people? Because
the issue of biological origins is a scientific issue, and there are scientific theories of biological origins. I think Darwinism is a scientific theory. I think intelligent design is also a scientific theory. But however you answer that fundamental question about how life got here, you are going to pose an answer or present an answer that has larger worldview implications. Every worldview has to answer some basic questions. One of them is, what is the thing or the entity or the process by which everything else came? Darwinism answers that question by reference to a completely materialistic process, and therefore it has implications that support a materialistic worldview. And for many scientists and for many people in the popular culture, Darwinism, therefore, is providing an indispensable plank in essentially a system of thought, a worldview. Michael Ruse, a fellow I've debated, a friendly Darwinist on the other side of the debate, has noted in a book that he's written that Darwinism has functioned as something of a secular religion for many scientists. And so when you challenge it on scientific grounds, invariably, or very often, you will get a somewhat unscientific and very passionate, even zealous, emotional type of reaction.
Now, when we come back from the break, we'll have a final 4 minutes with Stephen Meyer. His book is called Darwin's Doubt. I want to ask him, is the designer God? And does the data tell us that? So don't go away. Back in just 3 minutes with Stephen Meyer. My name's Frank Turek. See you in a few minutes. Don't touch the dial. Frank Turek back with you. Our website, crossexamined.org. That's cross-examined with a D on the end of it, .org. I'm talking to Stephen Meyer, his new book, Darwin's Doubt. Hey, Steve, you've, I think, in this book and other books, your signature in the Cell book as well, show beyond any reasonable doubt, in my mind anyway, that there is a designer out there. Well, does the data show us that the designer is God?
Well, it's a tricky question, but one that I think has a clear answer. I think if you look at the evidence from biology alone, you see powerful evidence of a designing mind. This is what Darwin's method allows us to establish, that kind of cause, that the only type of cause of which we know that can produce the kinds of effects we see in life is an intelligent one, a mind, not a material process. But that cause, from looking at the biological evidence, could be an immanent intelligence within the cosmos, or it could be a transcendent cause beyond the cosmos. We can't really tell, because the evidence of design arises well after the beginning of the universe, and there might have been some being prior to us that existed that's responsible for it. But I think when you bring in other evidence from physics and cosmology, I think you can make a very strong case that the overall best explanation is actually a theistic design hypothesis, because we see in physics that we have evidence of design from the very beginning of the universe in the form of the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and in the fine-tuning of the initial conditions or arrangements of matter at the very beginning of the universe. So that the universe itself, in its very fabric and structure, gives evidence of design. Now, clearly no agent within the cosmos could be responsible for the design of the cosmos itself, the laws of physics that apply to every being within in the universe. And so when I think when you take the evidence for a definite beginning from cosmology with the fine-tuning in physics and the evidence of design in biology, I think if you take those and weigh them together, I think there's a very strong case to be made for theism, that is to say, for a transcendent intelligent God is the best explanation for the whole ensemble of evidence that we find in the natural world. So I think there is actually a strong case to be made for God, though in the books I write about biology, I make clear that the evidence has theistic implications, but it does not provide a proof of God's existence.
And by the way, you unpack that very well in that DVD series you did called True You. So if people want to see the entire argument for God, you can get Stephen Meyer. And it is called True You, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah, exactly. True You. Does God Exist? It's a DVD product that was done with Tyndall Publishing, and I think Coldwater Media, Focus on the Family, jointly worked on it. And it's a 10-part lecture series. And there I'm able to start with the cosmology and the physics and then move to the biology. And I show that you can use this same method of reasoning, inference to the best explanation, to assess which of the competing worldviews provides the best metaphysical explanation of the entire ensemble of evidence. And there I think the case for God is very strong.
All right, Steve, I got 20 seconds. We got this new book, Darwin's Doubt, people need to get. If people want to get a hold of you or read more, where do they go website-wise?
Go to darwinsdoubt.com, where Darwin's Doubt has no apostrophe, just darwinsdoubt.com, or to the website at the Discovery Institute. And I'd especially follow the ENV News, our blog, which has updates on the cut and thrust, the back and forth, because there is a very active debate going on about the book right now.
Excellent. Stephen Meyer, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Steve. My name's Frank Turek. Check out Stephen Meyer there. You can also go to discovery.org. If you'd like to know more about what we do, go to crossexamined.org. That's cross-examined with a D on the end of it, .org. Great being with you. Thanks to Bobby for engineering this whole thing, and to Janet. See you next time.